Welcome back, 5th grade. We're on Domain 8, Native Americans, Lesson 13, Separation of Native American Tribes. Our objectives are to explain the different perspectives of land ownership affecting Native Americans, and we're going to develop and strengthen our persuasive essay by revising and editing. Our key vocabulary for today: isolation is a separation from other things or people. Revive is to make someone or something strong, active, alive, or healthy again. A petition is a written request signed by many people asking someone in power to do something. And sustenance is food and drink that gives nourishment and keeps someone or something alive. We're going to go ahead and do a read aloud today. Chapter 10, The Taking of the Land. By the late 1800s, nearly all Native Americans had been forced onto reservations or assimilated into U.S. society. Forcing people onto reservations did not bring peace. Even on the reservations, far away from their ancestral lands, stripped of their culture, and forced to learn a new way of life, some Native Americans would not give up the fight. Eventually, Congress passed the Dawes Act, officially the General Allotment Act of 1887. The Dawes Act was the final act that forced an end to the conflict between the United States and Native American tribes. This act did away with reservations altogether, based on the belief that the only path to survival of Native Americans was for them to assimilate and own land as individual family farmers. It did not simply take more land or carve up existing reservations. The Dawes Act actually aimed to destroy the heart of Native American cultural identity, the one thing no other treaty or act of Congress had done. Under the Dawes Act, reservations were broken up, and Native American families who lived on those former reservations received 160 acres of land, the same amount granted to settlers or homesteaders by the Homestead Act. This act forced Native Americans to work and survive as individuals and not as part of a tribe. However, most of the acreage that was allocated was on existing reservation land that was usually unsuitable for growing crops. While most homesteaders had a good chance of making a living off their 160 acres, most Native Americans had no such luck on their dry, dusty allotments. Any land not claimed by Native Americans were made available for sale for non-Native American settlers. Those who could not earn a living from their allotment had to sell their land to non-Native American settlers for needed cash. The former reservation homelands were chopped up into little pieces, and hunting and fishing territory was lost. Many people left the former reservation land and never returned. Those who remained struggled to survive. Worst of all, rather than a sense of belonging to the land, they felt a sense of isolation and sadness. The people were scattered, and all remained, it seemed, were stories and memories. To understand why the Dawes Act was so damaging to Native American tribes, you must understand what lay at the heart of the Native American culture identity. Many factors contribute to cultural identity. Language, clothing, food, and religious practices are all important, but they are really only pieces of the puzzle. These things only provided clues to a person's culture. The true core of a person's cultural identity cannot necessarily be seen, heard, or tasted. Cultural identity is something people feel and know deep down inside, regardless of what they wear or do, and regardless of where they live. When Native American children went off to the boarding schools, such as the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, they changed their clothing and language. They traded in their homemade animal skin clothes for woolen suits and dresses. They learned to speak English, they learned about a new religion, and they learned how to work in factories and on farms. They did everything their teachers told them to do, everything that was supposed to erase their cultural identity, but it did not work. In the end, they were still Native Americans. Why? What was it about the cultural identity of Native Americans that could not be easily erased or forgotten? The answer to this question is both simple and complicated. Land. It is simple because it's easy to see why the land was so important to Native Americans. But it is complicated because according to the Native American traditions, there is more land than dirt and rock. There is more to land than dirt and rock. There is more to it than plants, animals, and all the resources necessary for survival. Land is not simply a place where a tribe lives. Land is a part of the tribe itself. Land is the thing that makes the tribe whole. Anyone can learn to hunt, but how many people know how to make a perfect bow and arrows using only materials available on the grassy prairies? How many people can look at the forest floor and immediately know what kind of animals have walked through the area in the past few days? How big they were and what direction they were heading? How many can predict the weather by watching birds or observing the moon? How many people do you know can find enough food in the desert to feed an entire extended family of 50 or more people? To not only survive but also raise a family and live comfortably in the forest, plains, or desert requires great skill and knowledge, more than a single person could teach himself or herself. Living such a lifestyle brings people into direct and intimate contact with nature, with the land itself, as well as the sky and waters, and with other people with whom they must work and share in order to live. This was very different from the way people of European descent lived at the time, and is very different from the way Americans and Europeans live today. Rather than conquering or taming the land, Native Americans blended into the land. They built sturdy, cozy houses. They moved across the land following age-old trails. They had excellent tools, but not machinery or factories. They possessed incredible amounts of knowledge not necessarily found in a library. For people living today, survival in the forest or other wilderness would require all our energy and time. How much spare time would you have for fun and games if you found yourself in the wild with nothing but your hands and brain to provide food, clothing, housing, and fuel? Most likely you would spend all day looking for food and still go to bed hungry and probably cold too. Not so for Native Americans. Native Americans lived comfortably and usually had plenty to eat. They had time for things other than hunting and gathering. They made music and danced and told long, engaging stories. They had celebrations and feasts, and they played games. They were skilled artisans, crafting boats, fine pottery, basketry, jewelry, dolls, headdresses, baby cradles, and all sorts of beautiful objects using whatever was available on the land. This was true long ago and is still true today. From this closeness and intimacy with nature, Native Americans developed their truest sense of cultural identity. Their knowledge of the land was the source of not only of food and shelter, but also of their stories and beliefs. The spirits they worshipped lived on the same land as everything else. Furthermore, wherever they went, Native Americans walked in the footsteps of their ancestors, whose very flesh and blood were also part of the land. For Native Americans, everything was connected to the land. As long as the tribe was together on the land, they were able to cling to their cultural identity. Without land, there could be no tribe. And so, after decades of wars, treaties, and acts of Congress, the U.S. government finally understood that any land Native Americans were permitted to own as a tribe allowed them to maintain their cultural identity. This is where the Dawes Act finally succeeded where other acts and treaties had failed. It destroyed the sense of connection between the tribes and the land. In the process, it almost defeated the tribes themselves. Before the Dawes Act of 1887, there were nearly 150 million acres of land in Native American hands. By 1934, when the Dawes Act was finally overturned, Native Americans own about 48 million acres. In other words, as a whole, Native Americans had lost over 2/3 of their land. Fortunately, though, with the overturning of the Dawes Act and the Indian New Deal of 1934, Native American tribes were allowed to own land once again. Furthermore, they were allowed to exist as separate nations within the United States. Today, the total land owned by Native American tribes has risen slightly to about 55 million acres. That is only about 2% of the total land in the United States, but it was enough for Native American tribes to revive and renew the core of their cultural identities. The connection to the land on which the tribe depends, that revival continues to this day nearly 100 years later. The Dawes Act. The most important part of the Dawes Act involved the division or allotment of land to individual owners. As long as the Dawes Act was in effect, no tribe was allowed to claim ownership of any land. Instead, the land was divided into individual lots and given to individual owners. Besides the destruction of their cultural identity, Native Americans also lost even more land as a result of the Dawes Act. Many simply sold their land to anyone who was willing to buy it. Others lost their allotments because they went into debt after borrowing money to try to make ends meet. Some allotments were never given to the Native Americans at all, but simply handed over to homesteaders. The Hopi Petition. In March of 1894, the Hopi people in the Arizona Territory sent a petition to the Washington chiefs in response to the Dawes Act of 1887. They had observed U.S. agents marking their land and were worried about the effect of the Dawes Act would have on their life. Thomas Keam, owner of the trading post, transcribed the Hopi Petition. During the last 2 years, strangers have looked over our land with spyglasses and made marks upon it, and we know but little of what this means. As we believe we have no wish to disturb our possessions, we want to tell you something about this Hopi land. None of us were asked that it should be measured into separate lots and given to individuals, for this would cause confusion. The Hopi's land was arid and difficult place to grow crops, and over hundreds of years they had learned to adapt to the environment. Our fields are numerous but small, and several belonging to the same family may be close together, or they may be miles apart, because arable localities are not continuous. They shared farmland among families and moved their farms when winds blew the fertile sands across the land. The American is our elder brother, and everything he can teach us, except in the method of growing corn in the waterless, sandy valleys, and in that we are sure we can teach him. They did not want to lose their cooperative way of life or the freedom to move their farms as needed. We most earnestly desire to have one continuous boundary ring enclosing all the Hopi lands, and that It shall be large enough to afford sustenance for our increasing flocks and herds. The Bureau of Indian Affairs never sent a response to the petition. Our word work for today is revive. Today, the total land owned by Native American tribes has risen slightly to about 55 million acres. That is only about 2% of the total land in the United States, but it was enough for the Native Americans to revive and renew the core of their cultural identities, the connection to the land on which the tribe depends. Revive means to make someone or something strong, active, alive, or healthy again, and it is a verb. So referring to this rubric again, we're going to go through our persuasive essays and make any edits or revisions that's going to strengthen our writing. So we're going to look at spelling, grammar, word choice, and anything else that you think you might want to change. This is your editing checklist. So as you're reading through it, notice these things and see if you have found them. So do all of your sentences, are they complete, and do they have a subject and predicate? If they do, you're going to do a check mark. Are all your paragraphs indented? Check mark. And you're going to go through and double check. And make sure you have a goal for your editing. What do you want to accomplish to make it stronger in the future? So your assessment today is to complete your final draft of your essay. So you're going to do your edits and your revisions, and then you're going to finish up and make it your final draft. And we will see everyone in our next lesson.